In the early 1930s, the man known to history as Benito Mussolini frequently appeared on the balcony of Palazzo Venezia in Rome, with tens of thousands of people gathered below, creating a scene that clearly demonstrated the power and control he had achieved in the heart of Italy. Born on July 29, 1883 in Predappio, Mussolini rose from a poor family to become the supreme leader of the nation, and since being appointed Prime Minister on October 30, 1922 after the March on Rome, he gradually consolidated his position through restructuring the political system, issuing policies to stabilize society and promote the economy in the context of post-World War I Italy, full of instability. In the 1920s and early 1930s, Mussolini's government carried out large-scale infrastructure development programs. Land reclamation such as the Pontine Marshes project expanded the transportation system and at the same time implemented policies to increase agricultural production such as the battle for grain, thereby helping to reduce unemployment and consolidate the image of a strong state. He also reached an agreement with the Catholic Church through the Lateran Treaty in 1929, resolving the long-standing conflict between the Italian state and the Vatican, thereby further strengthening the legitimacy of the regime. Under his leadership, the image of Il Duce was built as a symbol of discipline, order, and the aspiration to revive Roman glory, making many Italians believe they were living in an important period of transformation in the nation's history. However, those images were gradually replaced by a different reality as Europe entered World War II, and Mussolini's political and military decisions began to reveal serious limitations. Military campaigns in Greece and North Africa failed, the economy weakened, and Italy became increasingly dependent on Nazi Germany, causing Mussolini's position in the alliance to decline markedly. By 1943, he was overthrown and arrested by the Fascist Grand Council itself, a turning point that showed the cracks in the very system he once controlled. Although rescued by German forces and continuing to head a puppet government in northern Italy, his real power was no longer the same as before, while the war continued to devastate the country. In April 1945, as Allied forces advanced closer and Italy fell into chaos, Mussolini tried to flee but was captured by resistance forces, and on April 28, 1945, he was executed by firing squad in northern Italy, closing the life of a leader who had once reached the peak of power but ultimately had to face the collapse of both himself and the regime he had built. Before moving on to the next part, please hit subscribe and leave a like to support the channel. That is the simplest way for you to accompany us on the journey of exploring stories of power, ambition, and the prices paid in history. Born on July 29, 1883 in the small town of Predappio in the Emilia-Romagna region, Benito Mussolini grew up in a poor working-class family, where living conditions at the end of the 19th century in rural Italy were still full of shortages and instability. His father, Alessandro Mussolini, was a blacksmith with strong socialist ideas, often expressing views against religion, the government, and the upper class, while his mother, Rosa Maltoni, was an elementary school teacher who was Catholic, representing discipline, education, and traditional beliefs, creating a family environment full of contradictions between two opposing value systems. From a young age, Mussolini was clearly influenced by his father, not only in political thought, but also in his hot-tempered personality and tendency to resolve conflicts with violence, something that showed early in his school years when he frequently got into fights with friends and teachers, and by 1898, when he was only 15 years old, he was expelled from school after stabbing a classmate with a knife during a personal conflict, an event that clearly reflected his limited ability to control emotions and his tendency to use violence as a tool. The following teenage years of Mussolini continued to be marked by a series of conflicts with the education system and local authorities, as he frequently violated discipline, opposed teachers, and showed an attitude of not accepting power imposed from outside, while being deeply influenced by political debates in his family and the surrounding working-class community, where ideas about social inequality, class struggle, and opposition to the current order were openly discussed. Although he encountered many behavioral problems, Mussolini still continued his education and later trained to become an elementary school teacher in the early 1900s, a step that showed he was not completely removed from the system but still had the ability to adapt when necessary. However, the teaching job did not keep him for long, as he quickly turned to political activities and journalism, fields where he could directly express his views and influence the public. During this period, Mussolini began to form deep relationships with the socialist movements developing in Italy and Europe, especially in the context of the country undergoing uneven industrialization, leading to an increasingly clear rich-poor gap and widespread discontent in the working class. These factors, combined with his personal experiences in a poor family and a conflict-filled educational environment, helped shape an individual with a strong rebellious tendency, believing in the use of direct action to achieve goals, and not hesitating to challenge existing power structures, characteristics that would continue to develop and play an important role in his subsequent political advances. After the years of teenage conflict and instability, Benito Mussolini entered the early stage of adulthood with a path that seemed more stable when he began working as an elementary school teacher around 1901 to 1902, a profession directly influenced by his mother, Rosa Martoni. However, the teaching job did not suit Mussolini's hot-tempered personality and ambition, and after only a short time, he left the position, clearly showing his dissatisfaction with a stable life and the framework imposed by the education system. In 1902, at the age of 19, Mussolini left Italy and migrated to Switzerland, partly to avoid mandatory military service, but also to seek new opportunities in a more vibrant political environment, where socialist and workers' movements were developing strongly. In cities like Lausanne and Geneva, he quickly integrated into socialist groups, participated in meetings, speeches, and political debates, and at the same time took on many manual labor jobs to earn a living, from construction worker to waiter, thereby coming into direct contact with the difficult life of the immigrant working class. During this period, Mussolini began to demonstrate his skills in public speaking and writing, two abilities that would become important tools in his political career, as he used words to attract attention and influence those around him. However, his political activities in Switzerland did not go smoothly, and in 1903, he was arrested by the Swiss authorities for involvement in extremist political activities and later expelled from the country, forcing him to return to Italy in a context where he had no clear position. Upon returning to his homeland, Mussolini continued to pursue the political path by joining the Italian Socialist Party, or PSI, one of the main political forces representing the working class in Italy at the beginning of the 20th century. In the following years, he actively participated in the party's activities, wrote for local newspapers, and gradually built a reputation as an activist with strong views, ready to attack both the government and opponents within the socialist movement. Thanks to his sharp writing ability and direct debating style, Mussolini quickly gained attention and advanced within the ranks of the PSI, and by 1912, he achieved an important position when he became the editor of the newspaper Avanti, the official organ of the party, where he could directly shape political messages and influence thousands of readers across Italy. Here, Mussolini not only reflected the views of the socialist movement, but also clearly showed his personal imprint, with articles featuring strong attacks, using direct and sometimes extreme language to attract attention, thereby consolidating his position as one of the most prominent voices in the left-wing political movement in Italy. Before the major upheavals in Europe in the following years began to completely change the path he was pursuing. The early years of the 1910s marked the time when Benito Mussolini was at the peak of his influence in the socialist movement in Italy. But the outbreak of World War I in July 1914 quickly put him in front of a decisive choice. Initially, just like the majority of the Italian Socialist Party, Mussolini opposed Italy's participation in the war, seeing it as a conflict between capitalist powers that did not serve the interests of the working class. And in his role as editor of Avanti, he published many articles calling for maintaining a neutral stance. However, within just a few months, Mussolini's views changed markedly when he began to argue that war could be an opportunity to restructure Italian society, break the old order, and pave the way for a new, stronger form of national organization. This shift was not only a change in strategy, but also reflected a shift in his thinking, from an internationalist activist to someone who began to emphasize the national element and national strength. By the end of 1914, the differences in views between Mussolini and the PSI became irreconcilable, and he was expelled from the party, while also losing his position at Avanti, an important turning point that ended his period of activity in the orthodox socialist movement. Immediately afterward, Mussolini founded a new newspaper named Il Popolo d'Italia in November 1914, with the clear goal of mobilizing public opinion to support Italy's participation in the war. And through this newspaper, he began to build a new support network, including veterans, nationalists, and some industrial groups that had interests in Italy's entry into the war. When Italy officially entered the war in May 1915, Mussolini did not stop at campaigning on the media front, but also directly joined the army, serving in the infantry, a decision that helped him consolidate his personal image as someone ready to act, rather than just talk. During his service, he experienced the harsh conditions of the battlefield on the northern front, where trench warfare and continuous shelling created large casualties, and by 1917, Mussolini was seriously wounded when a mortar shell exploded near his position, causing him to leave the military after recovering. The war experience not only affected his physical health, but also deeply impacted Mussolini's political thinking, as he directly witnessed the total mobilization of society for war, military discipline, and the role of the state in organizing resources, factors that would later become the foundation for how he envisioned a political system that centralized power and relied on the comprehensive mobilization of the nation. At the same time, the war also increased Mussolini's prestige in a segment of Italian society, especially among those who believed the country needed a new direction after the conflict ended. And from the position of a journalist expelled from the party, he gradually became an independent political figure with the ability to connect different interest groups in a context where the old order was being shaken. When World War I ended in 1918, Italy did not enter a period of stability as many expected, but fell into a deep economic and social crisis, with millions of soldiers returning from the battlefield but without jobs, inflation rising rapidly, and the political system paralyzed under pressure from many sides. In that context, the unemployment rate increased sharply, the life of the working class became more difficult, and discontent spread nationwide, especially in the industrial cities of the north. From 1919 to 1920, Italy entered the period known as the Biennio Rosso, or the 2 red years, when a series of strikes, factory occupations, and workers' uprisings took place on a large scale, with the participation of hundreds of thousands of workers, and in many places even establishing workers' councils according to the revolutionary model. The middle classes, industrial circles, and landowners began to fear that Italy might follow the path of the Russian Revolution, where the old regime was overthrown by a proletarian revolution, and in that fear, the need for a force that could restore order and protect property became increasingly urgent. It was precisely in this chaotic context that Benito Mussolini saw a clear political opportunity, as he realized that instability was not only a problem to be solved, but also a condition to build new power. On March 23, 1919, in Milan, Mussolini founded the Fasci di Combattimento, a movement that gathered veterans, nationalists, and individuals dissatisfied with the current system, with the initial goal of opposing the socialist movement and restoring national order. Unlike traditional political parties, this organization operated flexibly and quickly developed into a paramilitary force with members wearing black shirts, later known as the Black Shirts. The Black Shirts groups not only participated in political activities, but also directly used violence to suppress opponents, attack union headquarters, destroy offices of left-wing parties, and threaten those considered opposition, thereby gradually establishing their presence in many areas across Italy. While the central government appeared weak and unable to control the situation, The activities of the black shirts received tolerance, even support from some local officials who saw this as an effective way to deal with the wave of workers' uprisings. At the same time, Mussolini also received financial and political support from industrial circles and landowners, who were concerned about the risk of losing property and power if the socialist movement continued to expand, and they viewed the fascist movement as a tool to protect their interests. The combination of organized violence, support from powerful classes, and the ability to exploit the unstable situation helped Mussolini quickly expand his influence, turning an initially small movement into a political force capable of directly impacting the national situation in the early 1920s. In the years 1921 to 1922, as the Fasci di Combattimento movement increasingly expanded its influence across Italy, Benito Mussolini began to shift from a leader of a paramilitary movement to a political figure with ambitions to seize power at the national level. In a context where the Italian government continuously changed, lacked stability, and was unable to control the widespread violence spreading between factions, the Black Shirts groups continued to operate strongly in many provinces and cities, using violence to seize local control, causing the central government to lose credibility more and more, while creating increasingly greater political pressure on the leaders in Rome. By the end of October 1922, Mussolini and his associates decided to carry out a strategic move aimed at forcing the government to hand over power, leading to the March on Rome event that took place from October 28th to October 30th, 1922, when about 30,000 Black Shirts members from various regions marched toward the capital Rome, creating a clear threat to the current government. While the fascist forces moved toward the capital, the government of Prime Minister Luigi Factor proposed declaring martial law to stop the advance. However, the final decision belonged to Victor Emmanuel III, and the king refused to sign this decree, a decisive choice that paved the way for Mussolini to move closer to power. The reasons for this decision were said to stem from many factors, including fears of the possibility of civil war, lack of trust in the ability of the current government, as well as pressure from conservative groups and economic elites who had already supported Mussolini as an alternative solution. In that context, instead of military confrontation, the king chose a political solution by inviting Mussolini to Rome to form a new government, and, on October 30th, 1922, Mussolini was officially appointed Prime Minister of Italy at the age of only 39, becoming one of the youngest leaders in the country's history. What is noteworthy is that Mussolini did not enter Rome with the Black Shirts forces in the role of a military victor, but arrived by train, clearly reflecting the way he achieved power through a combination of pressure and political compromise rather than a comprehensive revolution. After taking power, Mussolini initially formed a coalition government that included many different components, from liberals and conservatives to some military representatives, in order to create a sense of stability and legitimacy while reassuring the political and social forces that were still skeptical. However, while maintaining the form of a constitutional government, Mussolini began to gradually consolidate his personal power by expanding the influence of the fascist party within the state apparatus, using legal and political tools to limit opposition, and at the same time continuing to rely on the Black Shirts forces as a means of exerting pressure outside the official system. This process took place gradually but calculatedly, as Mussolini took advantage of his legal position to gradually transform the Italian political system from a constitutional monarchy to a centralized power regime, laying the foundation for the complete transition to dictatorship in the following years. After being appointed Prime Minister at the end of October 1922, Benito Mussolini did not immediately shift to an openly dictatorial regime, but proceeded to consolidate power through legal and political tools within the existing framework, creating a gradual but calculated process of transformation. One of the most important steps was the passage of the Acebo Law in November 1923, an electoral law that stipulated that any party or coalition that won at least 25% of the popular vote would automatically receive 2/3 of the seats in Parliament, thereby creating a significant advantage for the Fascist Party in elections. In the 1924 election, under pressure and violence from the Black Shirts forces, the Fascist Party and its allies achieved an overwhelming victory, allowing Mussolini to control the legislative body and gradually eliminate the remaining political opponents. In the same year, the assassination of opposition parliamentarian Giacomo Matteotti, who had publicly denounced electoral fraud and fascist violence, created a major political crisis. But instead of weakening Mussolini, this event became a turning point for him to advance further in concentrating power. By January 1925, Mussolini officially declared political responsibility for the country's situation and began to implement measures to establish a comprehensive dictatorial regime, marking the 1925 to 1926 period when the Italian political system was completely restructured. During this time, opposition parties were dissolved, independent trade unions were banned from operating, and all forms of political protest were placed outside the law, creating an environment in which only the Fascist Party was allowed to exist and operate publicly. To consolidate control, Mussolini established a security system aimed at monitoring and suppressing any signs of dissent, and by 1927, the secret police organization OVRA was established, operating as a domestic intelligence agency, with the task of tracking, arresting, and dealing with individuals considered a threat to the regime. Alongside the use of violence and surveillance, Mussolini also paid special attention to controlling information and shaping society's perception. As the press was placed under strict censorship, opposition newspapers were closed or forced to follow the government's line, while the education system was adjusted to spread fascist ideology and loyalty to the state. The cultural field, including cinema, art, and public events, was also used as a tool to build Mussolini's image as a strong and irreplaceable leader, with continuous propaganda campaigns emphasizing his role in restoring order and national strength. Through the combination of law, violence, information control, and image building, Mussolini gradually transformed the constitutional prime minister position into the center of a centralized power system where every aspect of political, social, and cultural life was adjusted to serve the existence and consolidation of the fascist regime. After having established a centralized power system in the mid-1920s, Benito Mussolini shifted his focus to consolidating the regime's legitimacy through building a symbolic leadership image, in which the title Il Duce, the supreme leader, was widely used in every field from the press, education to public events, turning Mussolini's individual into the center of Italian political and social life. The state-controlled propaganda system continuously emphasized his role as the one who had brought the country out of post-war chaos, restored order, and laid the foundation for a strong nation, thereby creating a standardized image that was repeated on a nationwide scale. Along with building his personal image, the fascist government implemented a series of public projects to demonstrate management and economic development capabilities, among which the standout was the reclamation program of the Pontine Marshes region in central Italy in the late 1920s and early 1930s, a project aimed at turning the marshy area into arable land while controlling malaria and creating additional jobs for the people, thereby being used as proof of the state's ability to conquer nature. Alongside infrastructure projects, Mussolini also implemented symbolic economic policies, notably the Battle for Grain campaign launched in 1925, with the goal of increasing domestic wheat production to reduce dependence on imports. And although this campaign achieved some results in production, it also led to the conversion of agricultural land from other crops to wheat, causing uneven consequences for the agricultural economy. In the field of relations between the state and religion, an important step was taken in 1929 when Mussolini signed the Lateran Treaty with the Holy See of the Vatican, ending the long-standing tensions since Italy's unification in the 19th century, recognizing the Vatican as an independent state and at the same time establishing Catholicism as the official religion of Italy, thereby further consolidating the people's support for the regime. Besides economic and foreign policies, the fascist government paid special attention to building a national identity linked to the ancient Roman past, as new architectural works in Rome and major cities were designed in a grand style reminiscent of the Roman Empire, while symbols, slogans, and public rituals were also built to link the current regime with the image of an empire that once dominated the Mediterranean. Parades, festivals, and political events were organized on a large scale, using visual and auditory elements to create an impression of strength, discipline, and unity, in which Mussolini always appeared in the central position as the representative of the nation's will. Through the combination of propaganda, development projects, economic policies, and the recreation of historical past, the fascist government not only sought to control the present, but also shaped the way the Italian people perceived themselves and their position in history, creating a system in which the image of Mussolini and the state became closely linked to the concept of strength and national revival. In the while, the image of Il Duce was built as a symbol of strength, discipline, and absolute control on a nationwide scale. Benito Mussolini's personal life reflected a more complex reality, where family relationships, emotions, and power intertwined in ways that did not always match his public image. Mussolini married Rachele Mussolini in 2015, although the two had been in a relationship for many years before that, and this marriage was tied to the early stage of his political career, when he was still active in the socialist movement and had not yet reached the peak of power. Rachele came from a rural background, did not participate deeply in politics, and largely played the role of a homemaker, raising the children, creating a traditional family image that fit with the values the fascist regime promoted. The couple had a total of 5 children, among whom the most prominent was Edda Mussolini, who was not only known as the daughter of the leader, but also played a certain role in Italian political and diplomatic life, through her marriage to Galeazzo Ciano, a figure who served as foreign minister in the fascist government. Alongside his official marriage, Mussolini maintained many extramarital relationships throughout his life, a fact that was widely known in Italian political and social circles at the time, even though it was not publicized in the official propaganda system. Among these relationships, the most prominent was with Clara Petacci, which began in the early 1930s, when Petacci was still quite young. And this relationship quickly became close and lasted until Mussolini's final days. Petacci was not only his lover, but also someone who frequently accompanied him in his personal life, and her presence beside Mussolini in the final stage of the regime showed that the influence of this relationship went beyond the private sphere. At the same time, the Mussolini family gradually became part of the power system, as family members or close associates were given important positions in the government and state apparatus, reflecting a trend of concentrating power not only in the leader himself, but also spreading to the network of relationships around him. The appointment of Galeazzo Ciano to the position of foreign minister was a typical example of the connection between family and politics, when important decisions on Italy's foreign policy in the years before the war were directly linked to individuals in Mussolini's inner circle. Meanwhile, the public image of the Mussolini family continued to be maintained in a traditional direction, with Rachele and the children representing a model of a stable and united family that fit with the values the fascist regime wanted to convey to society. The parallel existence between a complex private life and a tightly controlled public image revealed another aspect of power, where the individual Mussolini was both the center of the political system and the coordinator of personal relationships that influenced the broader power structure in Italian society at that time, in the context where the power of the fascist regime in Italy had been consolidated, and Benito Mussolini's personal image had reached its peak in the early 1930s. The emergence of a new political figure in Central Europe began to attract his attention, and that of the Italian leadership. That was Adolf Hitler, who came to power in Germany in January 2033 and quickly established a dictatorial regime with many similarities in power structure. In the initial stage, Mussolini was seen as a model that Hitler admired, since the Italian fascist movement was born earlier and had succeeded in controlling the state, while German National Socialism was still in the process of consolidating power. The first meeting between the two leaders took place in June 2034 in Venice, a symbolic event in the relations between the two countries, where Mussolini appeared in the role of host and clearly showed his position as a leader who had stabilized his power, while Hitler was still trying to assert his place on the international stage. Throughout the meeting, Mussolini appeared superior in demeanor and experience, while Hitler, although he had already taken power, was still judged to lack confidence and had not yet reached the level of comprehensive control like his counterpart in Italy. However, these initial impressions did not fully reflect the rapid changes taking place in Germany after 2033, when the Nazi government began rearmament, violated the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and implemented a series of policies aimed at expanding influence in the region. In the following years, Mussolini observed this development with increasing interest, as Germany not only recovered militarily, but also consolidated its economic and political position in Europe, creating a new center of power capable of competing with traditional powers like France and Britain. At the same time, international developments also began to affect how Italy positioned itself in the international relations system, especially when Mussolini's foreign policy decisions, including the expansion of influence in Africa and the Mediterranean, led to tensions with Western countries and changed existing diplomatic relations. In that context, the relationship between Italy and Germany gradually shifted from cautious observation to more frequent contact, as both countries recognized common points in their approach to power and political goals, especially the desire to adjust the European order after the First World War. Although initially Mussolini still kept his distance and did not yet see Germany as an equal partner, the rapid changes in the European balance of power began to create a new foundation for relations between the two countries, as strategic, economic, and political factors gradually pushed Italy to reconsider its position and the possibility of cooperating with a strongly rising Germany. These changes in the European balance of power after 2033 quickly placed Benito Mussolini before new strategic choices, especially when Italy's international position began to come under pressure from his own expansionist foreign policy decisions. One of the most important steps took place in October 2035, when Italy launched the invasion of Ethiopia, an independent country in East Africa and a member of the League of Nations, with the aim of expanding territory and affirming Italy's role as an imperial power. This military campaign lasted until May 2036 and ended with Italy declaring the establishment of the Italian East African Empire. However, the diplomatic price paid was significant, as the League of Nations imposed economic sanctions on Italy, including restrictions on trade and political isolation, making Mussolini realize that relations with Western powers like Britain and France were no longer as reliable as before. In the context of being isolated, Mussolini began to look toward Germany as a potential partner, where Adolf Hitler continued to consolidate power and expand influence, especially after Germany reoccupied the Rhineland in March 2036 without encountering significant military reaction from other European countries. By October 2036, Mussolini officially declared the formation of the Rome-Berlin Axis, a political agreement between Italy and Germany that marked a clear shift in Italy's foreign policy, from maintaining distance from Germany to closer cooperation. This change was not only the result of external factors but also reflected Mussolini's awareness of the need to seek an ally capable of supporting Italy in pursuing its strategic goals. At the same time, Europe entered another conflict when the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, and Italy decided to intervene by supporting the forces of General Francisco Franco, providing troops, weapons, and finances to ensure a friendly government in Spain. Germany also joined in supporting the same side, and the coordination between the two countries in this war further deepened the relationship between Rome and Berlin. In the period 1936 to 1939, military and political cooperation between Italy and Germany increased steadily, while Mussolini gradually adjusted his stance to align with Hitler's objectives, including accepting some policies he had previously opposed. This process led to the signing of the Pact of Steel in May 2039, a formal military treaty binding the two countries in a close alliance, committing to mutual support in the event of war. This treaty not only strengthened the relationship between Italy and Germany, but also marked a turning point in Mussolini's position on the international stage, as he shifted from the role of an independent leader to a partner increasingly dependent on Germany's military and political power. While initially Mussolini had been seen as the predecessor and influencer of Hitler, By the late 1930s, Germany's superior development in economy, military, and industry had reversed this relationship, placing Italy in a weaker position within the alliance and forcing Mussolini to adjust his strategy in an international environment increasingly dominated by decisions from Berlin. After signing the Pact of Steel in May 2039 and tying his fate closely with Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini initially still maintained a certain distance when war broke out in Europe in September 2039, declaring Italy in a state of non-belligerence, because the army and the economy were not yet ready. However, when Germany achieved rapid victories against France in the spring of 2040, Mussolini saw an opportunity to join the conflict with the expectation of gaining territorial benefits without having to bear too great a cost of war, and on June 10, 2040, he officially declared Italy's entry into World War II on the side of the Axis. This decision marked the shift from a waiting strategy to a full military commitment, but from the very beginning it revealed the limitations of Italy's capabilities compared to other major powers. In the first months, Italy carried out some military campaigns with the aim of expanding influence in the Mediterranean and the Balkans. However, the results did not meet expectations, especially the attack on Greece in October 2040, when Italian troops advanced from Albania into Greek territory but quickly met strong resistance and were pushed back, forcing Germany to intervene in April 2041 to stabilize the situation, thereby clearly showing the increasing dependence of Italy on German military power. Parallel to the Balkan front, Italy also participated in campaigns in North Africa, where Italian forces faced British troops in Egypt and Libya, but these campaigns also did not achieve the desired results, as British forces launched counterattacks and inflicted heavy losses on the Italian army, leading to Germany having to deploy the Afrika Korps under the command of Erwin Rommel to support its ally. The continuous German intervention in important campaigns not only helped maintain Italy's military presence, but also changed the balance of power within the alliance, as strategic decisions were increasingly made from Berlin rather than Rome. Meanwhile, in the rear, the Italian economy began to face increasing pressure due to rising war costs, limited raw material supplies, and an industrial system unable to meet prolonged military demands, leading to shortages of goods, inflation, and a decline in the people's standard of living. From 2041 to 2043, economic difficulties became more evident as supply lines were disrupted and industrial areas were attacked, reducing production capacity and causing discontent in society. At the same time, successive military failures on many fronts eroded Mussolini's prestige in both the army and the political leadership, as the gap between the propaganda image of a strong Italy and the battlefield reality grew ever larger. In that context, Mussolini's role in the Axis alliance gradually changed from an initially relatively independent partner to a leader who had to rely on German support to maintain military campaigns, while facing increasingly growing challenges both at the front and in the rear, as the war dragged on far beyond his initial predictions. The successive military failures in the period 1941 to 1943, along with the weakening economic situation and the growing discontent in society, shook the foundation of power that Benito Mussolini had built over more than 2 decades, and by the summer of 2043, pressure from both inside and outside the Italian political system reached a level that could no longer be controlled. On July 10, 2043, Allied forces landed in Sicily, opening a new front that directly threatened Italian territory and clearly showed that the war had entered an irreversible, unfavorable phase for the Axis. In that context, many high-ranking members of the fascist system began to doubt Mussolini's leadership ability, and on July 24 to 25, 2043, the Grand Council of Fascism met in Rome to discuss the country's situation, a rare meeting of this body after many years of being rendered ineffective. There, a resolution proposed by Dino Grandi was passed, calling for the transfer of military power back to the king, a move that in essence meant stripping Mussolini of his power. On July 25, 2043, Mussolini was overthrown by the Fascist Council itself, ending his official leadership role after more than 20 years in power. On that same day, When he went to meet Victor Emmanuel III in Rome, hoping to maintain his position, the king informed him of the decision to replace him with Marshal Pietro Badoglio and ordered his arrest, marking a sudden change in Italy's power structure. Mussolini was then detained at various locations to prevent any possibility of rescue, before being transferred to a hotel on a mountaintop at Gran Sasso, an isolated position intended to block any external access attempts. Meanwhile, Nazi Germany did not accept the loss of an important ally in the Mediterranean, and in September 2043, under Adolf Hitler's direction, a bold rescue operation named the Gran Sasso Raid was carried out by German special forces led by Otto Skorzeny. The operation took place quickly and successfully, as German forces landed by glider in the Gran Sasso area and rescued Mussolini without encountering significant resistance. After being brought to Germany, Mussolini met Hitler and agreed to continue leading a new government in northern Italy, leading to the establishment of the Italian Social Republic, also known as the RSI, at the end of 2043, with its headquarters in the town of Salò on Lake Garda. However, unlike the previous period, this government did not have real independence, but existed under tight German control, as important military and political decisions were all directed from Berlin. In the RSI, Mussolini continued to hold the title of leader, but real power was significantly limited, as German forces controlled most of the territory and the army, while using Italy as a defensive area against the Allied forces advancing from the south. Within the RSI, repressive policies were intensified to deal with the growing resistance movement in the north, leading to many arrests, executions, and armed clashes between fascist forces and guerrilla groups. At the same time, personal family relationships in the Mussolini family were also affected by the political situation, especially the case of Galeazzo Ciano, his son-in-law, who had supported the resolution to overthrow Mussolini in July 2043 and was later tried and executed in early 2044 on the orders of the RSI government. These developments clearly reflected the change in Mussolini's position, from a leader who controlled the entire state system to a figure dependent on German patronage, while real power gradually slipped out of his hands in the context of the war continuing to develop in an unfavorable direction for the Axis. In the first months of 2045, when the situation of World War II had clearly tilted toward the Allies and German forces in Italy gradually retreated under pressure from the south, Benito Mussolini's position in the Italian Social Republic became increasingly fragile, as the territory controlled by this government shrank and Italian resistance forces expanded their activities in many northern areas. By April 2045, as Allied forces advanced close to northern Italy, and German forces began retreating toward the border, Mussolini realized that maintaining the RSI government was no longer possible, and he began looking for ways to leave Italy, with the supposed goal of going to Switzerland or continuing on to Germany. In the last days of April, he left the Lake Garda area with a convoy including fascist officials and retreating German forces, in which Clara Petacci was present. Having decided to accompany him on this journey, the convoy moved northward through the Lombardy area amid chaotic security conditions, with many roads controlled by guerrilla groups. On April 27, 2045, near the town of Dongo on Lake Como, Mussolini was stopped by Italian resistance forces while traveling with the German convoy, and although he had tried to disguise himself in a German military uniform to avoid detection, he was still recognized and arrested. After his arrest, Mussolini and Petacci were taken to various locations in the area before being held in the village of Giulino di Mezzagra, where resistance commanders decided to carry out a quick execution amid concerns about the possibility that German forces or fascist loyalist groups might attempt a rescue. On April 28, 2045, Mussolini and Clara Petacci were shot at Giulino di Mezzagra, ending the life of the man who had led Italy for more than 2 decades. After the execution, the bodies of Mussolini, along with Petacci and some other fascist figures, were taken to the city of Milan, where they were hung upside down in Piazza Loreto Square, a symbolically significant location because it had previously been the site where fascists had executed resistance members. The images of the bodies hung publicly quickly spread, attracting the attention of local people and later captured by the press, becoming one of the clearest symbols of the collapse of the fascist regime in Italy. These photos, when widely circulated across Europe after the war, created a strong psychological and political impact, not only reflecting the end of a regime but also showing how power that had been built and maintained for many years could end suddenly and publicly. In that context, Mussolini's death occurred just a few days before the war in Europe officially ended in early May 2045, marking one of the important events in the final phase of the conflict. As the regimes associated with the Axis successively collapsed and Europe entered a period of comprehensive post-war restructuring. After the death of Benito Mussolini in late April 2045 and the complete collapse of the fascist regime in Italy, the country entered a period of profound transformation both politically and socially, as power structures that had existed for more than 2 decades were dismantled in the context of a post-war period full of instability. By 2046, a nationwide referendum was held that led to the end of the monarchy and the establishment of the Republic, marking the birth of the Italian constitutional referendum 1946, in which the Italian people chose to abandon the role of the royal family, including Victor Emmanuel III, who had played a part in appointing and then overthrowing Mussolini. This transition was not only a change in the system, but also reflected the efforts of Italian society to distance itself from the legacy of fascism and build a new political system based on democratic Guénébeau principles. However, the influence of fascism did not disappear completely after 1945, but continued to exist in various forms in European political life, from far-right movements to debates about the role of the state, power, and national identity in the post-war context. The alliance between Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, which was formed in the 1930s and formalized through agreements such as the Pact of Steel, is viewed by many historians as an important factor contributing to Italy's failure in World War II, as dependence on German military power not only diminished Italy's autonomy, but also dragged the country into military campaigns that exceeded its actual capabilities. During the course of the war, Mussolini's strategic decisions became increasingly influenced by Berlin, and the gap between his initial ambitions for an independent great power and the reality of dependence grew ever clearer, especially when failures in Greece, North Africa, and other fronts forced Italy to rely on German intervention to maintain its position. After the war, Mussolini's role became the subject of many historical debates, with some viewpoints emphasizing the early period of his rule when he carried out economic and social reforms, while other assessments focus on the dictatorial nature of the regime, the use of political violence, the suppression of opposition, and foreign policy decisions that led to war and great losses. These debates often place Mussolini in the broader context of 20th century leaders, especially when comparing him with figures like Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, who also built centralized power systems with far-reaching influence on world history. While there are similarities in the use of propaganda, social control, and political repression, historians also point out differences in scale, ideology, and degree of global influence among these regimes. For Italy, Mussolini's legacy lies not only in what he did during his time in power, but also in the lasting consequences afterward, when the country had to face economic reconstruction, political stabilization, and redefining its position in a Europe that was being restructured. In this context, the question about Mussolini's role in history continues to be raised, not only as an individual but also as part of larger upheavals that shaped the 20th century, where political decisions, international alliances, and personal ambitions could lead to outcomes far beyond initial predictions and leave long-lasting effects on future generations. The story of Benito Mussolini shows a clear lesson about how power can be built quickly, but can also collapse just as quickly when it lacks a sustainable foundation and balanced control. From a person of humble origins in Predappio, he took advantage of the chaos after World War I and the Biennio Rosso period to rise to power, using both legal means like the Acebo Law in 1923 and violence from the black shirts to eliminate opposition. This reflects a familiar reality. In times of crisis, people tend to seek quick stability, sometimes accepting the trade-off of freedom for order. For the American people, this is a reminder that democratic institutions such as the separation of powers and transparent elections are not to be taken for granted, but need to be continuously protected, especially when society faces economic instability or political division. Another noteworthy detail is that Mussolini was once in a leading position but gradually became dependent on Adolf Hitler after establishing the alliance in 1936 and signing the Pact of Steel in 1939. This shows that foreign policy decisions based on short-term ambitions can cause a country to lose its long-term autonomy. Finally, the image of him being captured on April 27, 1945, and executed just one day later in northern Italy is clear proof that power without responsibility and realistic calculation will lead to a sudden end. In the context of the United States, the lesson lies not only in being vigilant against promises of national revival, but also in maintaining a political culture that values the rule of law, transparency, and accountability in order to avoid repeating similar cycles of power in history. If you find the story of Mussolini and the lessons from power, ambition, and historical consequences thought-provoking, please hit subscribe and leave a like to support the channel. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore the figures who shaped the world and the prices they had to pay.